the one thing that I would sort of caution to sort of corporate issuers is political winds move, and just because it's short term the right thing maybe to pull out vocally and maybe align yourself with one side or the other, know that in 2 years time, 4 years time, things may be different. And so it's just a word of caution. Don't assume anything is permanent.
Hello and welcome from the sidelines of the ICR Conference here in Orlando, Florida. I'm Jarrett Banks, Editor-at-Large of CorpGov. Joining me is a repeat guest, Jon Solorzano, a partner and co-head of the ESG Taskforce at Vinson Elkins. Jon, welcome back to the program.
Good to have you here.
It was great to see you at our conference in Palm Beach, the CorpGov Forum, and we talked a little bit about ESG, but since the election and the climate and the new administration, what can you tell us about the state of ESG?
So it's a really interesting time to be doing what I do. As you know, your listeners are no doubt aware, ESG has had an interesting run in the last couple of years, where I think that there was basically an unfettered sort of assumption that this was kind of the wave of the future. That's kind of hit a wall, for lack of a better word. The anti-ESG sort of movement has gained a very strong foothold. They obviously now have sort of an ally in the White House. With the change of Congress, I think that there's going to be a perception that this is kind of a new way forward, and I think that that's correct. What I think is also something that should be made aware of is the ESG and the anti-ESG trends domestically are not necessarily how global companies should be thinking about the world. We are very much facing a continued strong regulatory environment, especially for the companies that do operations in Europe. I'm based in California. There's a whole slew of sort of blue state ESG regulations. And so I think that the macro trends are still trending in the same direction. I think that you're going to see corporates and some of the pressure from institutional investors abating quite a bit. And we've seen that already. And I can talk about, some of the things that we've seen even since the election itself. But I think that a lot of pressure on the institutional investors, which was driving a lot of the ESG momentum, has come to a screeching halt. I think that that's probably going to lay low for a period of time. And I think we're going to be entering into a world where it's a different set of pressures, whether it's regulatory requirements or customer preferences on ESG. I think the shareholder kind of loud vocal voice is probably going to abate for some period of time.
Do you think terms like ESG and DEI are going to survive?
So it's an interesting question. I think that the terms, I think it's very easy to politicize acronyms, and I think that that's probably what we've been seeing. I think that the issues that underlie ESG, environmental, social, and governance, or DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, I think that the mega trends will continue. I think for companies in particular that are like consumer facing, that have identified diversity, equity, and inclusion as critical to their business, or they think that it is to their stakeholders, will continue doing what they're doing. They might tamp down some of the rhetoric. They might start calling it something differently, but they will continue to push for, we believe that having a workforce that's representative of our customer base, for instance, is the right thing for our business. We might be a little less out in front on sort of making vocal donations to more polarizing organizations. We might cut back on, how we're talking about these things, because they frankly don't want to get caught in the crosshairs of some of the social media campaigns that have been very successful. With regard to ESG, I think that it's become a useful shorthand, but the problem with ESG is it means kind of everything, so therefore it sort of means nothing. And I think that there's a realization that it's probably too broad of a tent. And so, I'm a corporate governance attorney by background. That's what I focus on, is like boardroom dynamics, making sure that companies are structured in a way to manage risks, manage opportunities. I think that is going to stay core to kind of the ESG world going forward. I think that people are going to sort of talk a little bit less about the E and the S. But for companies that are, either seen as, facing significant risks, whether they're major carbon emitters or they potentially have some issues with labor or something, you're going to still need to focus on those particular issues, and you're going to be seeing pressure from your investors and from your stakeholder base, but it's going to be focused on particular issues, not ESG as this broad-based tent, because I think that the days of sort of the acronym are probably moving ahead for their course.
Makes sense. What are some of the strategies that these anti-ESG activists have used, and how have they evolved over time?
So I think that, there's probably a bit of a being flat-footed situation in the last few years, probably from like 2015 on to like call it 2021 or so, where the ESG movement just gained just tremendous momentum, and nobody was really questioning that. There was a lot of marketing around, this fund is ESG aligned, this company is making some sort of ESG initiative or what have you. I think that has hit two major headwinds. One, the anti-ESG sort of side, which has largely been sort of attributed to the conservatives, Republicans, has developed a playbook, one that's very effective. It's both, issuing shareholder proposals, which I don't think is actually moving the needle that strongly through shareholder proposals, but what has been incredibly effective are sort of these social media kind of cancel campaigns. You saw some of the problems that Target encountered, some issues with Bud Light, of course, and then recently, Robbie Starbuck has been very successful in getting what's perceived to be kind of conservative-leaning consumer bases going after these companies and telling them to pull back from DEI initiatives. So whether that's Tractor Supply Company or Ford or any number of companies. But on the flip side, you are seeing some companies pushing back on this. So for instance, Costco received an anti-DEI proposal on its shareholder ballot, and they put out some pretty strongly worded sort of response to it, basically saying this is fundamental to our business. We don't care if you think it's a bad idea. We know that it's a good idea and it's good for our customers. And so I think that what you're starting to see is kind of that dynamic play out, both on really technical kind of corporate governance proxy, but also like on Twitter Wars or X or whatever it's called now. Those I think are kind of the new front lines for a lot of this. And as I'm sure many of the listeners will sort of acknowledge, companies are pretty risk averse, generally speaking. And so I think that there's also this kind of herd mentality. A lot of people jumped into the ESG bandwagon or the pro DEI bandwagon, maybe without a ton of conviction behind it, and now they're feeling their safety in numbers and fleeing it. And so I think that that's some of the dynamic that's at play. The one thing that I would sort of caution to sort of corporate issuers is political winds move, and just because it's short term, the right thing maybe to pull out vocally and maybe align yourself with one side or the other, know that in 2 years' time, 4 years' time, things may be different. And so it's just a word of caution. Don't assume anything is permanent, because nothing is permanent.
I think we just saw an example of that with Mark Zuckerberg and Meta sort of
Correct.
Swinging back the other way.
Yeah.
How do you anticipate the SEC's approach to ESG disclosure and shareholder proposals will change under the Trump administration?
Sure. So, as I'm sure you're aware, the SEC last year proposed its sort of highly anticipated climate disclosure rule that was immediately challenged in the courts. That was going to bring a lot of companies into the fold where they were going to have to report on a number of climate risks, how their structuring was going to be aligned with the Taskforce on climate-related financial disclosures. That is almost certain to die. And so under the new SEC administration, whether it's going to be killed in the courts, it's in the 8th Circuit, which is a very conservative leaning circuit. It could die in the courts. It also could be formally pulled back by the SEC or an act of Congress. It's complicated. Don't want to get into those weeds. But that is one way that it could die. So it's almost certain to die. What I think could be really interesting, and I'm anticipating this, is one of the methods that pro ESG or ESG activism has really taken root is through what's called the 14A shareholder proposal method. And so a lot of companies deal with this on an annual basis on their proxy statements. They have a vote at their annual meetings of shareholder proposals. Those are issued through what's called Rule 14A8. The SEC under the Biden administration was very permissive of things that affected a significant societal issue getting on the ballots. So you had a lot of companies who now had to deal with put out a report on your initiatives for climate change, or how are you thinking about racial justice within your organization. Those were making on the ballots. They had mixed success, but they were certainly something that companies had spent a lot of time thinking about. I think under the Trump administration, under the new SEC chair, once they're formally appointed, it's almost certain that type of guidance will be sort of moved back to what we saw before the Biden administration. And so companies can probably breathe a bit of a sigh of relief that they're not going to be having to deal with all those proposals probably starting next year and going forward. This year, I mean, I'm personally dealing with a number of these for my clients. There are a ton of proposals. I think there's going to be a ton of proposals this year. Whether they're successful is going to be a completely open question. I don't think they are. I just think that the zeitgeist culturally is such that those proposals are not going to get a lot of support. I think in time, with the new SEC chair, you're going to see a chilling effect and people aren't going to bother bringing those proposals. So, but again, to my earlier point, that's now, that's not forever. And so just be very mindful that pullback can lead to unintended consequences.
Makes sense. And looking abroad, how should we think about international ESG regulations and their impact on U.S. companies, when it comes to global supply chains and customer bases?
Yeah, so, as I alluded to, Europe is continuing to move strongly under what's called the Corporate Social Responsibility Directive, CSRD. They basically are requiring any company that does business and has a significant size in Europe to make certain types of disclosures. There's phased-in reporting deadlines. That may actually also implicate a lot of companies who don't even think that they do business in Europe. They might have European customers, and those European customers have to report this information. And beyond financial materiality, which is how we in the United States think about what you need to disclose, you also have to disclose not only the impacts on risks to the business, but also the business's risks and impacts on society, the planet, things like that. So there's a wide-ranging set of disclosure obligations that a lot of companies are ill-equipped to deal with. Thinking through how is my product impacting communities? What is the impact of my plastic waste or my GHG emissions? All of those things we've never really had to think about in a publicly filed document that has to have the same or similar rigor to an SEC filed document. I think a lot of companies are going to be uncomfortable once it kind of comes to that, and also you're going to have a situation where you almost have like a balkanized world where you're disclosing one thing in the US and another thing in the EU, and I haven't even said anything about some of the blue state initiatives that are going to require this kind of patchwork of disclosure. So it's a brand new world for companies and one that is going to be a bit of a challenge.
Okay, last question. How do you see the role of institutional investors, proxy advisors, and activist NGOs in shaping the ESG agenda and influencing corporate behavior?
Yeah, so we've already seen this since the election. There have been some high-profile lawsuits or allegations of antitrust violations amongst the proxy advisors. There's kind of this perception of a duopoly between ISS and Glass Lewis. The fact that the big three institutional investors, BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard, kind of are monolithic, and they're probably 20 or 30% of most companies' shareholder base, have had these pretty staunchly pro-ESG voting records in the last couple of years. They have been muted, I would say, because of the concern of some of these allegations. Whether or not they're founded, they're really impacting them, and they're coming from attorneys general in various red states who are basically saying, you're boycotting the industry that sort of makes the economic engine in my state run. We are going to pull away our retirement fund dollars from you. That gets people to pay attention. And so I think that those types of activities are going to dampen the actions and the proactivity of the institutional investors, the proxy advisors, who may retrench a little bit more to historically what is more of a safe zone governance, the G. I think G is going to be where it's at probably for the next couple of years until the political zeitgeist changes, which I assume probably will happen, and that's just how American politics work.
All right, some good food for thought there. This has been Jon Solorzano, the partner and co-head of the ESG Taskforce at Vinson Elkins. I'm Jarrett Banks, signing off.